You're listening to The Scrimmage with Daniel Hargrove and Justin Domashevitz.
Yeah, baby, he's dominating right now. Monday, good morning, and welcome to The Scrimmage. I'm not an 80s metal band lead singer, but I am Daniel Hargrove, one of the show's hosts. Woo!
And I'm Justin Domashevitz. These intro noises get a little weirder every week. I think our co-host Daniel Hargrove might have a couple of screws loose, but we do have a great show for you today. If you watched any ESPN 8 The Ocho this week, you probably caught the slippery stair climbing world championships and the dodge juggle championship tournament, which I found incredibly interesting. We'll give you a thorough breakdown of those in today's show.
Absolutely fascinating. Also, a new test out of parts 1 and dos of our shows this week. But in this first part, we're going to stack it full of football, especially the 2-minute drill, which is going to start now, brought to you by State Farm agent Mark Rossetti.
It's not just a home or a car, it's the 6 months you save to get your Ultra HD flat screen just in time for football season. It's the overtime you worked for that third car so that your team can drive themselves to practice. While other insurance companies just see them as a bundle or a combo, State Farm agent Mark Rossetti sees your home and car as things you work really hard for. Mark understands what your things really mean to you and is here to help you give them the protection they deserve. Visit Mark Rossetti at 613 Oak Street in Aberdeen for your home and auto insurance today.
Let's go, huddle up! Gotta hurry. Hey, 2-minute situation, 44 seconds, hand the ball to the ref. Gonna do it right. 3 jet Buckeye, don't worry.
The 2-minute drill starts now.
The Chicago Bears have declined the 5th-year option on Mitchell Trubisky's contract. 2019 was Trubisky's 3rd season in the league, so the quarterback is still under contract for the 2020 season. Justin, does this change the way you look at the quarterback battle between Trubisky and recently acquired veteran Nick Foles?
Actually, yes, it does. Unfortunately, as much as I've been rooting for former Tar Heel Mitch Trubisky through this whole thing, and when Foles was traded for, I thought, well, you know what? Who's been a better backup than Nick Foles? I think it was a great move to bring Foles in just in case something happened to Trubisky. But the reason I think now Foles is more likely to win the job is because the only advantage that Chicago gained by doing this now instead of at the end of the season is it protects them in the event of a major injury that prevents him from playing in 2021. They could have waited till the 4th season was over and still not picked up the $23 million 5th-year option, which, if they had any belief that Mitchell Trubisky was going to have a breakout season this season, I think they would have waited. I think the writing is on the wall. Unless Trubisky does something magical this season, he's going to be gone. Several Seattle media members, including Mike Salk of the Brock and Salk podcast, were disappointed that the Seahawks didn't use an early pick to snag a wide receiver from the historically deep receiver class in the 2020 NFL Draft. Daniel, were you also disappointed?
I wasn't disappointed that they didn't take one early because I think they have way many more needs that they need to figure out besides the receiver position. But I was a little worried that they picked Freddie Swain, a dude who didn't do much in college by way of receiving at all. I mean, there's still some pretty darn good receivers out there, and that was their pick. Even that late in the draft, there are some talented guys out there who had a lot of college production. So this almost worries me that it could be another Amara Darboh situation where you're like, oh yeah, he seems like a talented guy, but he didn't do anything. And you're like, well, maybe there was a reason he didn't do anything. A debate has been raging in Florida over whether or not the Miami Dolphins should unretire Dan Marino's number 13 for first-round selection, Tua Tagovailoa. Justin, do you think the Dolphins should let Tua wear the number he wore in college? And I was all proud of myself for not stumbling over his name as bad as Commissioner Goodell did, and then I stumbled over the rest of the question.
Don't worry about it, Daniel. It's a difficult name. In fact, I had to watch a Twitter video to learn how to properly pronounce it, and I'm actually fairly familiar with the way that a lot of Polynesian names sound, so don't feel bad about it. I do think that in general, the practice of retiring jerseys is kind of dumb, and that some teams have gone way overboard to the point that there's a ton of numbers that you can't wear. But if there is a player that deserves to have their jersey number retired in Miami, how could it not be Dan Marino? He's the biggest star in the history of your franchise. He was a quarterback in a pass-happy offense before any quarterbacks really had that big of a pass-happy offense. He was shattering records from the beginning of his career. He was a transcendent star. I don't think in any way the Miami Dolphins should consider letting Tua take this number. The only way this happens is if Marino says, no, you know what, Tua, you take the number, you carry on the tradition. I do think that would be a really cool thing for Marino to do, to prove that he has confidence that Tua is going to take over and be the franchise quarterback, but I don't think he should feel obligated to do it in this situation. Andy Dalton was quickly signed by the Dallas Cowboys this week after being released by the Cincinnati Bengals, even as other quarterbacks like Cam Newton still have yet to sign. Dalton finished his career in Cincinnati as the Bengals' all-time leader in touchdown passes, completions, career passer rating, game-winning drives, fourth-quarter comebacks, and 300-yard passing games. He also holds team records for touchdown passes, yards, and a passer rating in a single season. He posted a 68, 50, and 2 record and helped the Bengals reach the playoffs 5 times in 9 seasons. Daniel, is the Red Rifle underappreciated?
Absolutely. I have loved the Red Rifle ever since he came into the NFL. I thought that he was underappreciated throughout his whole career there. I mean, it's the Bengals, for Pete's sake. He got him to the playoffs 5 times. I know that his record wasn't great there in the playoffs, and he did struggle a little bit, but I think it was more his doing to get him to the playoffs than it was the overall talent of that team. I think he's a great quarterback. I've always liked him since his senior year of college. I think the Red Rifle is underappreciated, and I think that the Bengals' new quarterback, Joe Burrow, is going to have a tough task in front of him to try and do anything with a franchise that notoriously is super cheap and doesn't spend anything to help their players out. What do you think, Justin? Red Rifle, you with him? You against him?
I wrote this question specifically for you, Daniel, because I know you have a soft spot for the quarterbacks who get viewed as good quarterbacks who can't get their team over the top. You have the same soft spot for Alex Smith. I view Andy Dalton in a similar way that the national media does. I think he is a good quarterback who can win a lot of games. He's very productive. He seems like a legitimately good dude. People generally like him. For whatever reason, he went massive garbage in the postseason to like the point where his postseason numbers, 0-4 in the postseason, 55.7 completions, 1 touchdown, and 6 picks in 4 playoff starts. They don't reflect how good of a player he is, and it's not that small of a sample size. So it feels to me in the Chad Pennington mold, like this is a guy who has he has great leadership skills. He is pretty accurate. He makes good throws. He knows how to take a risk, but he's not so crazy with risks that he throws a bunch of picks. I think he's a good quarterback who can lead you to a lot of wins, but teams are always looking for that like next explosive guy who can get you over the hump. So I guess if I were looking back on it, if I was Cincinnati, would I take Dalton again? Heck yeah, I would. I mean, you had 9 years of a really solid quarterback there for you, but I can't blame them for wanting to move on to something better. So I guess I feel...
Yeah, I don't blame him for going on to Joe Burrow's, but do I think that Andy Dalton gets a bad rap? Yes, because he's been in a division with the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Baltimore Ravens, who've been really good the past decade while he's been playing there, and yet he's still found a way to get that team into the playoffs for 5 years. I mean, that's impressive, especially when you think that outside of Andy Dalton and A.J. Green, what do you think about the Bengals?
Giovanni Bernard, former Tar Heel running back.
I mean, exactly. There's not much.
Yeah,
There's
and
not much.
They've tried to draft tools. They drafted John Ross out of the University of Washington in the first round to try to help out Dalton. That didn't work out at all because it turns out all he is fast, and he's got butter hands. So I think
shouldn't have had that popcorn.
It'd be why can't I play quarterback? I think if Andy Dalton goes on to have any kind of success after this, which is probably a tough hill to climb because even in Dallas, if everything goes the way the Cowboys want it to, they're going to have Dak and they won't have to worry about Dalton playing unless Dak gets hurt. But, Carson Palmer famously was very unhappy with what Cincinnati did while he was there. He was a very good quarterback in Cincinnati, and then he moved on and had pretty good success afterwards and even took a team to the Super Bowl. So, I mean, it's not crazy at all to blame the Bengals for what happened with Dalton. So I definitely can see what you're saying. I think when the postseason numbers are the thing that really makes the difference for me, because it seems like with all the success he had in the regular season, for whatever reason, he could not perform in the postseason. He had one postseason game also that was just an absolute puke fest where I think he threw for like 86 yards or something. So, I mean, you can blame the Bengals for most of it, but I don't think you can blame the Bengals for the disparity in his postseason numbers compared to the regular season.
And see, I think you can, because I think that he was doing yeoman's work just to get him to the playoffs. And when they're playing a team that's obviously also good in the playoffs, it's going to be really hard to perform well when you're playing against good competition. So that's my view on it. It'd be like, thinking that the Seahawks, after they beat the Saints, were actually going to do something when it was Matt Hasselbeck and Charlie Whitehurst trying to get things done there in Seattle. Like, yeah, it was awesome that they got there, but were they actually a good enough team to do much in that without a miracle Marshawn run? It just didn't seem like they were a level of competition that really deserved to be in the playoffs.
That's a fair point. That's an absolutely fair point.
I wanted to see what you were thinking about that receiver discussion. Do you think the Seahawks should have taken A, receiver earlier in the draft since there were so many good receivers in this draft, or B, a different one than Freddie Swain, who everybody went, who? And then looked him up and went, why?
I think people were... And it's interesting, too, because like even the way Mike Salk was talking about it on his podcast was like, I feel pretty good about the receiver group, but I feel like almost every year we've gone into a draft thinking, let's hope the Seahawks can pick up a solid receiver to add to the receiver group. And now they actually have a pretty good receiver group, but the receivers are really hit or miss, and there's no downside really to having depth at receiver. Wide receivers get injured a lot. A lot of teams are using 3 and 4 on the field at a time. So in a way, I kind of understand the sentiment, but I would rather see them address the needs that they addressed in the first, second, and third rounds. And once you got past mid third round, most of the top receivers were off the board. I think the sweet spot for receivers, from what I've been hearing, people's opinions on it, was like beginning second round to mid third round. Like that was the spot where you didn't get one of the best guys, but there's a really good group of receivers. You're going to get great value there. But I think the Seahawks felt like they needed to address different areas. And I feel better about the fact that they addressed the defense, at least in the second round. I'm not sure. I guess the third round pick is a little bit more dicey as far as whether they should have picked a receiver or not. I'd have to look a little closer at who exactly was left on the board at that point. But drafting a receiver was so far off my mind for the Seahawks going into this draft that had I not heard multiple Seattle guys mention it, I probably wouldn't have even thought about it.
So
yeah, I I wouldn't have thought about it too much, but I think the main name that gets brought up in this discussion is KJ Hill, who was drafted in the 7th round, so after Freddie Swain. And you go from Freddie Swain, you had 68 total receptions for his whole career at Florida, to KJ Hill, who is the all-time career leader at Ohio State in receptions. So it seems like, yeah, he might have lacked in 40 speed, but it seems like he was actually a guy who knew how to play the game and get open and make catches, and instead they went for a guy who didn't really show it.
How good of a returner was he? Because I haven't researched this, but my takeaway from the Freddie Swain pick was that they picked the best returner that they had on the board because they picked him to return, not to play receiver.
Yeah, and I get that, but in my mind, returners are a dime a dozen. Like, you find random dudes out there who can be really fast and return kicks in a lot of different ways. So using a draft pick on one, like, I don't quite get it. Like, you've seen good return men like Leon Washington bounce around and be available, and I don't know. I don't quite see that as, like, I understand it as a 6th round pick if you're just going for the returner, but I also watched his highlights, and usually when return men are playing in college, you see a lot of kick and punt return highlights, and I saw like one, and it was against like Rice or something like that. So it was like, really, it didn't seem like he stood out that much as like some outstanding receiver like that kid for North Carolina a few years ago did. Where it's just
Switzer.
Like, Switzer. Every single time he caught a punt or a kick, you were holding your breath. This guy was like, and his one punt return for a touchdown, and I saw in his highlights, it was like he ran straight.
Okay. Like I said, I hadn't researched it, but I think interpret or looking at that pick and trying to grade it as a receiver, from what I have heard from the front office, like what they've been saying to the press and in interviews and stuff, they feel like this offseason is going to dramatically impact the ability of especially skill position players to make an impact on the game, because they won't be able to practice with the team nearly as much and all that. John Schneider compared this year to the year that the lockout happened, and how that impacted the ability of rookies to come in and learn the playbook and play with the team. So I think, and again, like I said, I don't know how he graded as, I don't know if there were better returners available at that point, but I think that they picked him because they felt like, or I think that they picked him to come on and return as close to immediately as possible, rather than for anything to do with his receiving.
Yeah, I hear you there, but honestly, just watching highlights, and probably just because I'm a little bit more familiar since he's from the Northwest, but I'm kind of hoping that Aaron Fuller turns into that return guy, because some of his highlights at Washington are pretty darn ridiculous. And I mean, he had returns in big time games like against Utah. So I don't know. I think that's definitely going to be open for competition. So it'll be interesting to see.
Mm-hmm.
All right, that was the 2-minute drill, and then further discussion brought to you by State Farm agent Mark Rossetti. Thank you so much